Well, today I'd like to talk about our Revit redo project. And this is a really comprehensive type of project, very similar to what you might do at the start of the design process, where you have a big idea for what you want to do for your interior. But you need to get going and create it on the computer. Okay. And so there's a number of steps that I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'll talk about kind of general strategy, these 5 steps to Revit Joy, I like to call them. And then we'll talk about some specific tactics, procedures that might help you with some different kinds of materials. So anyway, let me get myself a sketch here, and since I'm on the computer, I'll just do it electronically. And first of all, the thing you want to start with is modeling the easy stuff, the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. And I'm going to just turn on my notes here, and this is my annotated diagram. Again, I did it on the computer because it's a lot easier. Generally, most projects are going to have fairly standard elements that you can use for the building in the space enclosing elements. And often they have custom materials on them. Usually they do. But you can use just generic walls, especially in a project like this where we're not doing construction drawings. We're just trying to make it look good. Okay. So second, you're going to want to search for ready-made elements. And by this, I mean things that you can hunt down off of manufacturers' websites. Look on form fonts, which is a big source for models, Revit City, that sort of thing. Something that maybe isn't perfect, but you can modify. Okay, and that's really a big time saver. Usually, sometimes you get something that's kind of incomprehensible, but even objects which are from SketchUp can be used. But you have to be careful because those SketchUp objects, they're not great for everything, especially if there's a lot of curvy elements to it. SketchUp objects look a little bit faceted, and I'll show you what that looks like. But then also if they're painted with like a fabric type of material with a pattern, that can often not show up particularly well in SketchUp objects. But solid colors, reflected colors, those all work great. Okay, so that's your second step. The third step is really where you start to customize things. And there are all sorts of different ways of customizing things. There are in-place masses, there are in-place families, and then there are kind of custom families where you use the family editor, so you're not in your model. And then finally there are conceptual masses. So each of those has their kind of place. So that's your sort of third level of joy. Then to get to the fourth level, you need to really think about lighting and materials. Okay, and those two tend to go together. Often we use glowing materials, which don't throw off any light, but they do look like they're throwing off light. You'll find that we often use a lot of studio lights to make our project look like they do in the photographs. Just photographers tend to use a lot of studio lights. So are we. Anyway, so that's your fourth step. The last and final step is to try to get your camera position to match. To do that, it's really helpful to either sketch or find a floor plan view and or a section view. I happen to have stolen this from what do you call it, architectural record, and so I was able to get a section which gave me a sense of how high it is. You see how there's actually a scale, and then I could also pin down exactly where in the project the space is. So I'll just take a little look here at my project, Private Office by LVC Kiramoto and Canon Design. And you really need to find a project where it's doable in terms of complexity, not too complex, not too easy. And this one has a lot of that. You can see if you really take a look at it, the walls, pretty straightforward, the floors, ceilings, all pretty straightforward. Even this dropped ceiling in the back is pretty much a standard ceiling. There are some custom elements like this light fixture, these chairs, and this sculpture. what it really helps with these articles is if you scroll down and take a look at it, and it does actually have a lot of information about what the materials are. If you can find those materials, it'll make your life a lot easier. And I actually did that. I looked up the furniture, which is, I believe, a Knoll piece of furniture, or at least pretty similar. Even if it's not exactly what's in there, I can probably get a Knoll Revit files here. Knoll has Revit files for all of its furniture, and probably modify them to look the way the image is. Anyway, so studying that image is a really great way to begin. And what I have here are a series of models that show kind of these stages. So this is the basic stage. I have generic walls that I used. The floor is also generic. The ceiling obviously is not the same as the one in the picture, but I just used a 2x2 ceiling because it's easy to see in the drawing. Okay. The next one, I've loaded in a couple of standard elements. Here are some of those Knoll chairs. Here is a bench and a divan and a light fixture that I actually found on Form Fonts. Or 3D Warehouse, can't remember. And just to show you that you can indeed use SketchUp objects. The real big trick with SketchUp objects, there's a couple of things you need to do. First of all, if you're making it yourself and you're drawing curves, make sure that the curves don't have a lot of facets. So you can make a very much smoother curve in SketchUp. This isn't a SketchUp lesson, but that would certainly help smooth things out. Also, you want to put things on layers that make sense based on their material. So in this image, in this fixture, I have a glowing disc that's on one layer. Everything else is on basically a chrome layer because it's chrome fixture. And everything should be exploded, all the subgroups and whatnot. It's a good idea. It helps to explode everything. You should also make sure that everything is painted both sides using the default material. Now, a lot of the models that you will find are actually already painted that way, which is super handy because it makes it easy in Revit. Finally, my Revit is a little picky about what version SketchUp it recognizes. I usually just save it as an old version, version 5 or 6 of SketchUp. If the model is giving you trouble, and I believe one of these models did, I save it as, export it as an AutoCAD file format. And that often gets rid of some of the weird problems of, say, nested groups and components and things like that. So anyway, there you go. You have examples of me trying to save time by downloading furniture that's pretty close to what I'm looking for. Now, in this view of the model, I have added one or two other elements that are just custom elements, and this gives me a chance to talk about different types of families. This object here, well, let's start with this one. This is the simplest type of element that you can create. It's a mass in place. So if you go to Massing and Site, and choose In Place Mass. What it will allow you to do, first of all, you have to display masses. So a lot of times people will create things and they're like, where is it? You have to go to the Visibility and Graphic Overrides and turn it on. Okay, and I'm just going to check, don't just show that again because I know it by now. Anyway, you'd give it some name, extrusions. You can even extrude single lines. Or curvy lines if you don't need something with thickness. This is, it works great with the paint bucket. You can just paint the faces of this thing in 3D view. You don't need to have family parameters. Now that said, it doesn't work in any family schedules or any of those sorts of things. And in some ways it's a little bit of a pain because you have to paint every surface. It does mean that you can't sort of apply paint to the whole thing all at once. Not easily anyway. The second step is to do what I did here, which is model a family in place. And as a reminder, you go to Component, Model in Place, and then you can choose which family it goes in. Now, normally, most projects, you want to be pretty rigorous about like, oh, that's a lighting fixture, that's a whatever, nurse call device. I don't know why that gets its own category. I often will do just generic models or furniture, just because I know I'm not doing a schedule or anything like that. And I don't want a highly complicated family, something like a door or a light fixture. Often in something like this, I know that they've faked the lighting in, so I think I'm going to fake the lighting in also. The third type of family you can create is when you create a family that's a standalone. File, new, family. The big advantage of this separate modeling environment is I find that it's easier to model certain complicated elements because you don't have all the building elements in the way. For example, this front desk was a little tricky, but I modeled it in place because I wanted to align it with these walls. Okay, it's much easier to do that in the model. For something like a piece of furniture, it's easier to model out on its own. Now, just as a reminder from a previous lecture, when you create a family, you can assign parameters in a number of ways, but the easiest way is here when I select an object. Basically, when you have an object that you have masked, oh, well, this is not a great example. Here, let's take something a little simpler. You can assign a material here just by picking a material, or you can assign a family parameter. If I click associate family parameter, let's say I want to make a new one for the legs. Okay. Obviously it wants to be a material parameter. If you choose type, all legs in the entire project will change when you change the materials. And that's why you have to edit the family in order to change them. If I choose instance, I can change each one unique in a unique way. It's also faster because you just click on the object and change its parameters. So if you have just a couple of pieces of furniture, it's probably easier to use instance parameters. Otherwise, I would use type parameters. Okay, there you go. Parametric lesson for the day. Anyway, the final one is this conceptual massing environment. And as a reminder, you go to File, New, Conceptual Mass, and I have placed on Canvas a conceptual mass for smaller objects. So Windows allows you to open up a Windows file browser, and you can actually drag this guy in here, or you can right-click on it and copy it and then paste it into this menu. Or you can just browse for wherever you saved it on your computer. That's also a possibility. Anyway, this conceptual massing environment that special one that I created, it just allows you to create smaller objects really easily. This is a much smaller environment. Otherwise, it works pretty much the same. Okay, so finally, I have applied materials and lighting to all the different parts of the project. And as a reminder, first of all, most objects that are standard Revit objects like floors, walls, and ceilings can just be painted using the paint bucket. I like to use the default 3D view. Okay, if you're having trouble painting some area, for example, this front desk, don't forget that you can isolate that front desk using the section box tool, which will kind of hide away the rest of the model. What's really cool about this particular tool, first of all, obviously you still can expand this. The other thing that you can do, which is kind of neat, is if you want to save this as a separate view, but you don't want to go through the whole, right click here and blah, 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 blah. All you need to do to save this image as a separate view, like we were doing in a previous assignment, go to the navigation wheel, and there actually is an option down here if you go and it's Save View. And what that will do, it'll create a new option here, and we could call it, desk or something like that. And it will save that view here in your list, and it'll turn your 3D view back to its default view, which is kind of nice, just saves you a step or two. When I'm painting these materials, obviously I can only paint those surfaces which are valid surfaces. So you do have to be careful. Objects like this front desk, I will have to go in and assign parameters. Okay, so if I go down here and I choose Edit Type, I should see the material for the front desk. Okay. Finally, some objects such as these light fixtures, what I've done is I've actually applied a material that is just a glowing material, okay? And if you take a look at what I've done for the rest of the project, I have a lot of these studio lights floating around. And again, I've posted some studio lights onto Canvas that are super easy. Let me just go to my Visibility and Graphic Overrides menu, VG, and show you the lighting. And anyway, I turn on that light source, and this allows me to aim these fixtures. You see how these fixtures have a big cone, and that is what allows you to kind of shine lights on different elements. Again, these are just studio lights kind of floating in the space, but I think if you study the image for this project and any of your projects, see that bright spot there? And how bright the front end of this table is. They've used some fill lights in here, okay? Anyway, other materials, I would strongly recommend creating all of your materials all at once. We have a leather material, we have a shiny material, another shiny material, some glass, some chrome, and then a funky new custom ceiling. When I go to create materials for a project, as I mentioned before, I give them my name or my initials. It's nice, puts them at the top of the list. What I also like to do is I make a custom library. And you can create your own library if you want. A couple of reasons I do that. One, it makes it easy to get materials from one project to another. And if you do more than one project, and you will, that's really nice. Anyway, you can open it here, and you'll see here I have, my special materials that I have created. That's what I called it. It's a very clever name. And what you can do is you can literally drag the materials. These are the materials in your project. You can just drag them into your custom library. Okay, I've already got them in there. Now, once we start talking about materials, let's really get into some of the things that materials can give you. And the biggest thing is when you're creating a material, make absolutely sure that you take a look at the preview of what it's going to look like. So when you go to Appearance, make sure that you expand the image so that you can really see what it's going to look like. A couple things that we do frequently, we create materials using image files. A couple things you should do. First of all, if you create a new material, and I'm just going to create a new material, it's usually called default new material up here. What you'll see up at the top is it uses a generic kind of template for the family. Make sure that you duplicate that duplicate that asset. Watch what happens when I change this. I'll just zoom in on it a little. I'll duplicate the asset, and now it says generic number 37. The reason is if you have a bunch of materials that you're creating all at once, they are all going to change if they all use that same generic sort of family asset. Let's take a look at my custom ceiling. And as a refresher, the ceiling has kind of, I think, about a 4-foot spacing. So I'm going to create a custom ceiling, and I'm going to use an image file for that ceiling grid. Okay. Now let me take a look at this image file that I've created. It's over here, and it's called a ceiling grid pattern. Okay. And I basically just drew a bunch of lines, and they're seamless. The right side and the left side, when these edges butt together, it's going to look like just a continuous grid. Okay, it's a seamless pattern. And there's a couple other advanced tools, and I know that some of you are better at Photoshop or whatever, but I like Illustrator because I can quickly select objects and change their stroke so that I can experiment and get just the right look in my ceiling. Okay. Now, when you save this, you can save it as a JPEG or as a PNG. Either one will work. So back here, I want to find that pattern. Let me just click on the Assign button. And here it is, my ceiling grid pattern. Okay, click Open. And what you should see is that the pattern starts to march out on the wall. And I can use a number of things, including reflectivity and also a bump map. But you'll see here that, first of all, you can link the texture transformations. And what that does is if you use any bump maps or things like that, it will change those as well. And I have set this to be about 12 feet wide, which I think should work pretty well. Okay. You can experiment, obviously, as you apply the material, after you apply the material, to see if you like it. Now, you can have a reflectivity. The ceiling was particularly shiny. Okay. So I made it fairly reflective, but not super reflective, just based on the image. And finally, I use a bump map. And again, the bump map, I can use this same picture and make it look as if these lines are actually sticking out. So you can see here that I've let it run a little bit to get me a little better preview. I think that bump map is a little deeper than I like. So I'm going to scroll down here to where the bump is. It's a little hard to see the whole thing with such a big preview, but my screen is tiny. Anyway, the way bump maps work, it starts at 0, which is basically no bump, and you can make it go sort of in or out. So you have to kind of experiment with that a little bit to get a look that you think is going to work for your part of this little adventure is getting the view composition to match the image file that was kind of our inspiration. And that's a little tricky. Let me just put this into a shaded view here. By the way, I tend to operate with a shaded view just because my computer gets a little slow. If I run it in realistic view, I know that when you're doing something like this, you need to see the materials. But if your computer's starting to get all poopy, that's why. Anyway, to modify your view, you may have figured out that you can hold down the Shift key, which obviously I can't show, and you can click and drag your scroll wheel, and orbit works the same as before. When I'm really doing these custom kind of elements here where I really want to tweak the camera very precisely, I do two different strategies. One, I use the steering wheel, okay? And the steering wheel has a number of features which are really nice. First of all, the up-down feature. It allows you to move the camera just ever so slightly up and down. You can often see, let me just close that, if you can just see the top of, say, some surface in the image file that is your inspiration, that absolutely is what you're going to use to help you. Obviously, you can pan, right, left or right, and you can use the look tool. You can walk in and out. Obviously, orbit, zoom, all those work. The other thing that you can do gets a little more tricky. Using the down arrow here on the bottom of the steering wheel, there are a number of options. We used this to save our view earlier, is to increase the focal length. Okay, and when you do that, what you'll see, it's a little tricky. As you scroll out, it's kind of like using a different kind of lens in your camera. So you're kind of getting more and more distorted. Again, it's going to depend on the kind of camera they used in your original image. But you can see how when I crop this down, it's a little more distorted than it was before. You can also go the opposite route and decrease the focal length. Or if you're like me and you want to see what did it look like before I made that change, you can go back out and come over here. And there you go. It doesn't look significantly different. Unfortunately, changing the focal length in Revit is not as dramatic as in SketchUp. Okay. The other thing that you can do is, and I do this sometimes when I'm really struggling to get the camera positioned the way I want, WT for window tile, and that's also under the view menu, and it'll put the two views side by side. So one thing you can do here, I have the two windows tiled. If I zoom in a little bit on my section and I click the crop region of this 3D view, see how it shows up as a camera in this view here. this is where you can really do some kind of tweaking. You can adjust how deeply the space is cropped. So as I do that, you see how it crops away the back of the space. Obviously, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But if you have something in the background that you don't want to see, this is a nice way to do it. You can also control what the camera is focused on. Sometimes that can get a little out of control, okay? So you can kind of rotate the camera. You can even use the rotate tool, or you can straight up just move the camera around in a number of ways to try to get a different view. Obviously, I've now walked through a wall, so I can't see this space anymore. So there are a number of camera options that you can fiddle around with to try and get an interesting view, especially if one of your views is, say, like a worm's eye, where you want to see it from above. You can really get some very interesting views, but obviously it does require moving the camera in a little more aggressive way. Watch what happens when I change the crop region. You'll see the cone of vision change in my camera. Okay, so there's no way to do it in the other view. You basically just have to change the crop region in order to get the view limits that you want. So as you can see here, this is my Revit rendering, and this is the actual image. And I think I have the eye height a little high. I think the legs aren't right on some of these things. You know, there's definitely some things that I need to tweak. I didn't really put in any of these doors or some of the lights, but you can see this is a, you know, not a bad start. Obviously, some lighting needs to be a little more refined than the two bubbles here on the back wall. But you can see that most of the pieces, the major elements, are here. They just need refining. The last thing I want to talk about today is just some advice on when you have some particularly pesky objects that are difficult to create. First of all, Revit has some ready-made masses that you can create. If you go to the massing and site and choose place mass, it's going to ask you what kind of mass do you want, and you can load masses in. There's a whole family folder filled with different kinds, cones and cylinders, and I don't know what a diagnostic tripod is, but there you can get one of those truncated elements. And these can be edited, but they're awfully handy if you just need a simple shape for one thing or another. You can even use these to do what's called Boolean operations, where you subtract one volume from another. And they accept paint just like other objects. Another type of custom object, a custom door, is to just create a curtain wall storefront type of system. That's the one that comes in and it's already got a door frame, a window frame on it, and all these elements can be changed. If you choose edit type, you can sort of fiddle around with the spacing of the vertical pieces and the horizontal pieces, okay? But you can also, what's nice about it, first of all, you can kind of customize it just by selecting it and choose edit profile. Which we've seen before, and let's say I want, I don't know, something round at the top. I can just do a round piece. I'll just do it like that. What it'll do is it'll delete elements that don't make sense with this new arrangement, okay? You can even delete individual pieces. So for example, if I want to make this just an opening, I can unpin, and you see how that pin is preventing you from making changes. Just unpin it, unpin it, and then you can delete it. And then if I want to delete this panel, you have to kind of tab through to get just the curtain panel. And again, unpin it. And you could actually, once you have the panel selected here, you can choose edit type, and you could load in, say, a door or something like that. Or an empty panel. So you see here I have the empty system panel. I'll just click OK. Now when I click off of it, it's just, that's just what you guessed, an empty system panel. Okay. You can also try to move the vertical mullions here. If you can find that separating line, that separates the centerpiece. Again, you can unlock that and in theory kind of nudge it over to the dimension that you want. It starts to look a little bit more like a door. Okay, it's not perfect. You can't edit every bit and piece, but the advantage of doing it this way, once you've used the curtain wall, you can go, I'll just go to the floor plan view here real quickly. And if you drag the curtain wall into your wall, what will happen is it will actually break the wall as if it was a door. Okay, so that's kind of handy way to create custom elements. All right. Now, another thing that people often want to do is create funky and difficult patterns that have a lot of like transparency to them. For example, something that's like a light fixture that's made out of wire, a ball of wire or something like that. Now, that can be really difficult to create unless you, but you can use a material with transparency. Let me show you what I mean. So let's go to the materials library and I'll show you. I've created a material called wire ball. Okay. And what I did is I used an image for a cutout, okay? And I'll go here, and it's basically some scribbles, okay, that I downloaded that are seamless. I've inverted it so that the black, which is the part that's cut out, is the part that I want. I just want some lines, and I've sized it to make it work for me, okay? And what you'll see here in my preview is that it's doing exactly what I expected it to do. It's leaving anything that is white and cutting out anything that's black. Okay, and you can even add some additional features to this image. For example, you could add a bump map, and here I'd like to talk a little bit. Let me turn on the bump map. Whoop, it didn't work. Turn on the bump map, but rather than using a map, let's use one of the ready-made, these are called procedural maps. There's one here called noise. And what that'll do is it'll just give it a little bit of kind of texture. Okay, see how it gives me a little bit of dottiness. Okay, and obviously you can crank that up to get even more. It will look a little weird if you crank it up too much. Anyway, I'll click OK and apply. And then I'll use my paint bucket, PT for paint. And try to remember what I called this thing. And hopefully it will paint onto my sphere. Now, you can use this same procedure for other types of objects. I have created a mass in place here of just a surface. Sometimes we want like a screening element or something like that. These mass in place objects are really great if you choose, like I showed before, massing in sight, in place mass. What you can do, we'll just call it whatever, you can sketch out any sort of object. I just drew a spline on the ground, okay, and then basically extruded that spline, okay. Very similar to what we've done in our conceptual massing environment. And like that conceptual massing environment, you can select points and all that. And this is great if you want to just, you want some curtains or something like that. And the only way you can do it really is with these masses. Anyway, yeah, I'm going to discard that. These masses can be painted the same way. I'll just come back here and paint. However, the paint doesn't always work the way you think it is. So be careful. The material does kind of warp in unpredictable ways. All right. Now, the last thing we're going to do is the most complicated, and this is something we like to do sometimes, which is create foliage on, say, a wall that's growing out of the wall. What I do, first of all, I create one of those mass in place elements, just an extruded line, really. And I'll leave it kind of a little bit out from the wall, just to mimic kind of there being a little bit of growth hanging out from the wall. And then I go and I create a custom material like I did before. Now the big trick is here with this custom material, I use the same cutouts and the same bump maps that I used before, but I didn't have those to start with. What I needed to do, let me go to my Photoshop application here. I took an image that I had that was seamless. So again, don't forget search for seamless. In Photoshop, what you can do, there are what are called adjustment layers. And if I'll just use my zoom here. Down here, there is a kind of half circle that says create new fill or adjustment layer. I'll choose that, and there's one of these for black and white. And I've already created it, so I'm going to turn it on. And you can see the image turns, you guessed it, black and white. Okay, and this is great. You can see it gives me a range of tones, but really for a bump map, you want a little bit more contrast. You want there to be really white, bright spots and really dark spots. So I add another adjustment layer. Again, I go down here and I choose this brightness contrast. Let me just turn it on, and I've adjusted that a little bit. So if I double click on it, I can come out and change how contrasty my contrast is. Okay, I'll just cancel out of that. I think I like the way it is right now. And then I can also change and this is great for like a depth map, because I'm getting some darkness to show that parts of this are farther back than other parts, and I am still getting some blacks down in the deepest area, but they're not super black, because you just want a little bit of depth. Fine, and in Photoshop you can export that image, export as, save it as an image file. I name each of these. I might call the main one, my seamless leaves. One of them will be a cutout image, and one of them will be a depth, bump map. So anyway, finally, I use this one called curves to get myself a really stark image. And the way this works, let me call up the curve menu here. There's basically, yes, you got it, a curve, a diagram that has kind of the dark, medium, and light spots in the view. And I'll just adjust this, and you can see how as I drag the curve around, it has different effects. Things come out, kind of highlights come out, or if I want to get rid of those spots, say, that really need to be cut out, I can just drag these curves. And it does take some experimentation, and of course each image is a little different. So anyway, I'd save that as my cutout map. This is great because I've got some blacks for the part of the image that I basically want to disappear. Let me just go back to my main image here and zoom in. I don't want to see all this wood and stuff like that, so I want to get rid of that. And it would be nice if I could get these forward bits of the leaf to jump out a little. Anyway, so back in Revit, let's go back to our friend Revit. In our materials library, go to Manage, Materials. What you'll see is I've created the leaf file, and it uses that image cutout pattern pile, large leaf image. I made these 8 feet, whereas I think in the smaller one it's only 4 feet. And sometimes that's nice, partly because I don't really know which one is going to work all that well. But then you just dump it as a paint, and you can see here, whoops, that it's fairly convincing. And you can also, I'm just going to copy this kind of leaf wall here. See how they're much smaller. Again, you'll just have to experiment with what works in your particular project. And then if you really have the need, you can have these multiple layers, and sometimes you get a real interesting effect there where you don't see all the way through the wall for most parts. So you can see here that the materials are, in fact, showing up. They're even casting shadows, as they should be. It's not perfect, but it's not too bad. Obviously, additional sophistication is going to be had if you use the ArchVision RPC elements, which are available on the desktops in the library in the VPAC 206. There you can get plants with more sophisticated edge characteristics, and you can even create your own RPCs from images, and then they'll cast shadows naturally. But anyway, these are some techniques for creating pretty unusual elements. This one I created basically by drawing black stripes in Photoshop. And then creating a custom material. And again, you can see this would be a heck of a lot easier. It's a lot easier to do this way than it would be to model this shape. So that's basically it for creating any really custom design that you want. In this case, we're trying to recreate some images, but when you're working on your own projects, I would strongly recommend kind of diagramming things out the old-fashioned way by hand or in some kind of sketch on the computer to figure out what you're going to do and what order you're going to do things first. That really helps when you trying to plan your time and get the project done at the correct due date.